Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. As you can already tell from the title of this video, I would like to address something that has been addressed multiple times by others, and you can find the videos on YouTube and so forth here. So this will just be a short video, and inshallah in the future I intend to give a presentation on this topic inshallah. And this is regarding the hadiths, or the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There are people out there who rejected the Sunnah or the Hadiths, and they are called the Hadith rejectors or the Quran only. Okay, they only care about the Quran only. They only care about the Quran, and they disregard the Hadiths due to a lot of reasons that they have actually given. Inshallah, we will address them in the future. Inshallah, I have some ideas for a slide presentation. And in my future videos, especially the ones that are more like academics and so forth here, I'll try to include them in slides presentation. So there will be something that I'm working on, because it's not easy to make slide presentation, although you can use some AIs and so forth to help you design the whole presentation and so forth here. So that is an area which I'm exploring. Right? This is called taking advantage of the technologies that Allah has made available for us today. But with regards to the Hadith rejectors, the reason that I don't really entertain them, or even kind of waste my time making videos and so forth, is because without the Hadith, how do they make Salah, for example? If there's no Hadith, how many Rakaat do you know how to pray for Isha, Maghrib, so on and so forth? And so those who reject the Hadith, they cannot say that I pray Maghrib 3, I pray Fajr 2 rakat, so on and so forth, because it is not mentioned in the Quran. The Quran, yes, the Quran mentions we should make sujud, we should make ruku, so for example, but it doesn't mention in detail as per what the Prophet had mentioned in the Hadiths, authentic Hadiths, obviously collected. And so the number one question to the Hadith rejectors, or those that rejected Hadiths, they are of different degrees. Some reject it completely, some reject it partially, so on and so forth here. But this video will just be to address the general. If they reject the Hadiths, then how do they know how to give zakah? How do they know how to make salah, for example? Do they not make salah? Then do they not give zakah? Then right. So the question is posed back to them. If they reject this Hadith, they reject that Hadith, so on and so forth here, or they reject it completely, then there's no Islam basically for them. There's no Islam. And so in my mind, it has always been, this is a really, really ridiculous argument. It is a non-academic argument, because if they just want to base their religion, their Islam, based on the Quran, then basically they are not practicing Islam then. And so, but you see some of them actually praying the same way the Sunnis pray. And then when you ask them, well, how do you know how to pray? They say, oh, because my father taught me, or my teacher taught me. Then where they get this knowledge from? Oh, it's from the Hadiths. Yes, it's from the Hadiths. And so there's no really strong argument. Right? And tons of works have been written, and tons of videos have been made on this. And I've watched tons of them. And I don't think that I can contribute anymore, right? Which is why I've not made the videos, because number one, the argument is really strange, it's bizarre. For example, another argument which we can bring on the table against these people is that, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that if you differ in matter, right, you consult back or revert back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet, and those in authority or those influential amongst you, those who have the knowledge, and so forth here. Okay, we can revert back to the Quran, which is basically reverting back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now how about reverting back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? If we reject the Hadiths completely, for example, if I have here Bukhari, pretend this is Bukhari, and I completely reject Bukhari or Muslim, then how do we refer back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? You can't. So basically now that ayah of the Quran doesn't apply to us already, which is wrong. So there's no really strong argument with regards to the hadith rejectors or the inkaril hadiths. So there's nothing much more that I can say actually, because if they don't have the hadiths or the sunnah, they don't have Islam. That means that any thing that they do, it's they made up. They made it up. Because for example, the Quran says, "Aqimu solah," pray, right? Establish solah, prayer. Okay, then how do you establish prayer then? Right. So there's no way for them to know unless they made it up themselves. Which is why in certain parts of the world today we have people that are doing practices that are completely not in accordance to the Quran and the Sunnah in terms of their acts of worship. And that is because I'm not sure if they reject the hadiths, right? But most probably they did not follow the Sunnah. But we are opening up doors for us to fall into a hole. Basically, we are basically not being smart. We are opening a hole for us, and it is completely unnecessary. It is completely unnecessary. And some of them say that we should be more critical, or we should be critical. Our scholars of hadith have been critical. Our scholars of hadith have been critical. Works have been published. Right? They will come up with all these arguments. For example, I see all this as secondary argument. For example, there is no original manuscripts of Bukhari. Right? There's no original manuscripts of Muslim, Sahih Muslim. And so all these things are actually arguments that fall flat on their faces itself, because we do not have the original manuscripts that Uthman wrote. Where is the original manuscripts that the Uthmanic committee actually wrote? We have the Birmingham Quran today, right? But did any of the scribes sign off their name? Okay, I am the scribes, or who I am, so on and so forth here. Right? And so the argument falls flat on their face itself, because now they have to reject the Quran also, because we don't have the original manuscripts of the Quran, of the Uthmanic Mus'haf. We don't have it, the original. Right? We have copies, which is the Birmingham Quran, right? Which is definitely the Codex of the Companions. Right? This is the strongest opinion, because the radiocarbon 14 dating dates to around 15 years after the 15 years after the caliphate of Umar bin Khattab. So it's the time of Uthman, right? But we don't know whether it is actually the Uthmanic Mus'haf which Uthman himself has, or one of the committee members, right? But we know that it is a companion Mus'haf because it's very early. And so we don't have the original according to the argument or the methodology posed by the hadith rejectors. And so now we have to reject the Quran also. What sort of argument is this? And so the argument fell flat on itself. So you can't have your cake and eat it twice. You have to be consistent in the methods that you use. You can't apply one method to another people and then don't apply the same method to you. Right? And so we don't have the original manuscripts of Bukhari Muslim. We also don't have the original manuscripts of the Quran. And so we shouldn't believe in the Quran then. And so this argument fell flat on itself. But then they will come back and say, no, the Quran has its own tradition because it is a recitation. And so it is preserved from a recitation point of view, but not the hadiths. And then we will question them, how come? What makes you think so? Because they say there are different narrations in the hadiths. And that is true, there are different narrations in the hadiths. But the qualification for the companions is that the companions don't say that this is the exact words of the Prophet. They say that the Prophet said something like this. Or I heard the Prophet say something like this. And so the whole science of hadith, right, is also quite similar to the science of Quran. But in the science of hadith, I would say the determining factor is that we have multiple narrations from multiple different companions. And the main gist of the message of that riwayat, of that narration, right, is there. You can't take the hadiths as the same level of the Quran, because the Quran is the speech of Allah, right? The uncreated speech of Allah. And the hadiths doesn't have that same caliber, which is why the Quran is the Quran and hadiths the hadiths. The purpose of the hadiths or the Sunnah is to explain the Quran. which is why scholars have always been authentic. We know who are the liars, we know who are the people that actually true in the narration of the hadiths. We know who these people are, we have their biographies, right? And for the hadith rejectors to claim that these whole biographies that are written by our earlier scholars are all made up, are all lies, and so forth here. And they have to bring their proofs. They have to bring their proof that supports their claims, and so forth. And they have to address every single key points. You can't just use one evidence to apply to the whole narratives of the hadith corpus. Right? Because then we can also apply the same methodology to you. And so you see where I'm going now, right? So which is why the argument that they pose doesn't really fly on itself. It falls flat on the ground, on the earth, exactly. And so our scholars have been critical of the hadiths. Our scholars were always critical of the hadiths, even until recently. Even till today, the whole department in Islamic University of Medina, the hadith faculty, right, they are critical of the hadiths. They study the hadiths, right? And so to say that Muslims are not critical of the hadiths or should be more critical of the hadiths, right? We have always been critical of the hadiths. Now people will say that in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, we have narrations or hadiths that are not authentic, da'if for example. But what they fail to know is that Imam Ahmad purposely put them there because students of knowledge will know that these hadiths are da'if, because they will care about the narrators, the rijal, the narrators. Okay? We have a whole science of rijal, ilmu rijal, basically look at the narrators and see whether the narrators liars and so forth here. Right? And so this is what the hadith rejectors, they are not really aware of. There's no other science comparable to the science of hadith, right? And obviously there's no other science comparable to the science of Quran today, right? Give me a similar case as rigorous as the methodology applied to our hadith literatures. Do you think the Institute of New Testament in Munster, Germany has the same rigorous science as they applied to their New Testament? Definitely not. Right? Do they produce the critical edition, the Editio Critica Maya? Now all the 4 Gospels have been published. I recently looked it up. Right? The Book of Revelation have been published, right? And so, do they have the same methodology, the same rigorous methodology that they applied to, as compared to the hadith literatures that we applied to? No. We don't even know. So if I were to use the Quranese only approach, we can basically take the whole New Testament and throw it out the window, because who wrote this? We do not have the original manuscripts, right? But to dwell again on this sort of argumentation without fully comprehending the picture as per the textual narratives and so forth, textual criticisms and so forth here, right, is to meddle in ways that will make you become a deviant. Right? So if you were to bring the claim to the Christian scholars and say that you should throw away your New Testament because there's no original, the scribes do not lift their hand and say that I am Mark, I wrote this gospel according to Mark. And so there's no manuscripts that says like that. But should we just throw it out the window? No, because they also have the consensus whereby they look at all the papyrus manuscripts, okay, of the 2nd century, the 3rd century, and it corroborates with Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So it is a strong reading, right? So it's corroboration of different manuscripts that produces their New Testament, right? And similarly, we have this sort of framework in the hadiths. It's just that the hadiths, we know exactly who the narrators are. So there is a chain, and we know who these people are. We know the different chain from here, from here, from here, from the companions. We know whether the companions are reliable, so on and so forth here. So basically, it is a much more robust criteria as compared to the New Testament. Now, I'm not comparing the New Testament with the Hadiths here, because the Hadith rejectors, they don't accept the New Testament. But what I'm doing here is I'm applying the same methodology for consistency. And so, if they want to have this, if they want to reject the Hadiths, then they should reject the Quran also, because using their methodology, we don't have the original. Right? And when they say the Quran is actually memorized, the companions memorized the Hadith as well. Right? The companions memorized the Hadiths. It's just that not to the exact word for word, because the Quran is preserved, and so does the Hadiths, which is why we know which Hadith is authentic, which Hadith is not authentic. But the difference between the Quran and the Hadiths is that the Quran is the speech of Allah, and the Hadiths is, with a few exception, right, it is the speech of the Prophet ﷺ, because the Prophet explains the Quran. The Prophet says that you pray 3 rakaat for Maghrib. This is how you give sadaqah. Okay, this is how you clean yourself. This is how you do this. This is how you do that. And so this is the speech of the Prophet ﷺ. And if you analyze the Hadiths, and if you analyze the Quran, even as a layman, right, even if your Arabic is not good, you can just read the Arabic of the Hadiths. Right? Read the Arabic of the Hadiths and read the Arabic of the Quran is completely different. Do you know that the amount of words that are being used in the Hadiths that appears in the Quran, right, is minute, which differentiates between the speech of the Prophet and the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is a miracle in itself. The other thing is, which brings me back to my first point, is if we reject the Hadiths, for example, or suppose we are even more critical of the Hadiths, but our scholars have always been critical of Hadiths, and we are so critical of the Hadiths whereby we don't have the original, so we throw it out the windows. Then we have to throw the Quran also out the window. Na'uzubillah. Right? So the methodology falls flat on itself. And so we now the main purpose here and the bigger agenda which the people needs to know is that the bigger agenda here is that they have been influenced by the Orientalists. The Orientalists have their own agenda, and that is to make people doubt the Quran. And one of the ways to make people doubt the Quran is they have to go through the Hadith first. And so if they make people doubt the Hadiths, then yeah, they have already won 50%, in fact even more, because now they can easily manipulate people to doubt the Quran. And that is the bigger framework here, right? These are all planned by the Orientalists, even though a lot of them, they already no longer here, but their influences are still there. And unfortunately, people are easily influenced, especially when it comes to the Quran, because Muslims have been saying, and in fact the Quran says, right, that their scriptures have been changed. Right? And so Muslims have the impression that the New Testament or the Old Testament, the Bible in general, have been changed. Right? Have been changed. And this is why we don't believe in the Bible. Yeah, one of the reasons. Right? And so what Christian missionaries does is that they bring these different ahrufs and qira'at, and then they show it to the Muslims. Look, you even have different readings in your mushaf, in your Quran, and so now the Quran is also corrupted. And the gullible Muslims will not be able to respond because they are shocked. This is the first time that they're hearing it. Right? And so what should their response be? They are shocked. That means now they have been fooled, basically. They have been fooled because of their lack of knowledge. They have been fooled. For example, this is the Quran. They say, this is the reading from one manuscript. This is a reading from another manuscript. And say, oh no. That's it. I couldn't believe the Quran also. And they also say that, now I have informed you the Hadiths. Okay, see, one reading of the Hadiths, one chain, another chain, is different reports. And so now you have the same also in the Quran. You have this one, you have different mushaf, you have different ahruf, so on and so forth here. But they don't play it in the ahruf way. They just show it the manuscripts or the different reading, right? They say, look, the Arabic here is different, the Arabic here is different. I thought you say there's only one Quran. And so the gullible Muslims on the street, they are trapped. Because why? They already built the false premise, right? Or they have been influenced of the false premise, which is the wrong methodology, basically, that the hadith should not also have differences in the wording, right? And so this is the lack of knowledge from the Muslims. And who's to blame? The Muslims are to blame. The people who are not studied or not studious and do not care, and so they are to blame. Because why? They have been poisoned. They allowed themselves to be poisoned. And so, which is why Sheikh Ibn Uthaymin says that the best protection for the Muslims is knowledge. You should acquire knowledge every single day, especially knowledge about your religion, the sources of your religion, the sources of where the Quran come from, the sources of where the Hadiths come from. Right? So the learned Muslim would point out that the methodology used by the Orientalists are actually poor because it falls flat on their own faces. So you can't have your cake and eat it twice. Basically means the methodology is incorrect. Right? The same for the Quran. No scholars of Islam claim that the Quran is a unilateral text. So where did people get this impression whereby there's only one reading of the Quran and that everything else is false? Right? Where do they get this from? They get this from, right? Because the people have been taking it the same as the Christian literature, right? And the Christian literature Christian missionaries themselves reverse it back onto the Quran and build the impression whereby there's only one Quran. Or Muslims over time, they build the impression also that there's only one Quran. Right? But that is actually not true. The Quran, there's only one, and that is correct. But it has been preserved in all of its ahruf, its qira'at that is authentic, as appointed by as defined by our scholars, the 10 qira'at, and so on and so forth. Some say more, some say less. But all these readings actually goes back to the Prophet ﷺ. And where is the proof for this? The proof is in the Hadiths. Right? And some people would say that you're arguing in circles because now we question your methodology of the Hadiths. Right? And my response to that, actually not my response of our scholars, is that no, we are not going in circles because we have addressed the methodology of the Hadiths. And this is our methodology, and we defended it. And the methodology that you are trying to imply onto us is actually false. Because then you will have to throw away all your literatures also. You have to throw away Plato. You have to throw away Aristotle. You have to throw away the writings of all the Greek philosophers. You have to throw away Ibn Sina. You have to throw away Ghazali. You have to throw away everything. You have to throw away the Veda, the Upanishad. You have to throw away the writings of Confucius. You have to throw away everything. And what would you have left? Nothing. Right? So do you know how flawed that methodology is? Which is why the first things first is the foundation is the methodology. If you don't have the right methodology, or if your methodology is not sound, then everything that you build on top of it falls flat on itself. Meaning you are wasting your time. Which is why when you write thesis in school, the very lesson before you start writing your thesis, the lecturer will go through with you the methodology. Right? And so that is why it is important for you to build a strong methodology. And it is not easy. It is not easy. Because people, students especially, would skip the classes on methodology. And I spent my career in school, so I know. Right? So students would skip their methodology, the class, they will not come. Right? And they start writing their thesis, start writing their essay. And a lot of them did not actually respond to the question or did not achieve the objective. Because why? The methodology that they apply is actually flawed to begin with. For example, if you want to know the census of how many people in that certain area, that certain village are actually able to recite the Quran, for example. Right? So there are methodologies that you need to apply for you to achieve that objective. If you apply different methodologies, right, then you will not achieve your objective and you will fail your paper, because you have not set up what you want to do. And it is not about the work that goes after it. You might put a lot of effort, you might put in a lot of work, you might travel here and there, spend tons of money to gather primary evidence, right? But if your methodology to begin with is flawed, then basically your whole work is basically a waste of time, irregardless of how much effort you put into your thesis or into your book, into your whatever that you are doing. And so the question of methodology is very important, which is why there is not a single treatise or not a single, I don't know what's the word to use, not a single thing can compare to the science of Hadiths and the Quran. Not a single thing can compare to the science, to the rigorous science of Hadiths and the Quran. And so to end this video, I will say to the Hadith rejectors, or the people who reject the authentic Hadiths, obviously if it's false Hadith we can reject, but we can still take lessons from it, right? And there are different categories as well. But the main purpose is, if it's authentic Hadith, it has a very strong chain of narration, it has been classified by scholars, a lot of scholars, that say that you can use this Hadith, you can use this Hadith, meaning it's authentic. And so if we reject this, basically means we are basically rejecting how are we going to make salah, how are we going to give zakat. There are partial rejections, people who rejected partially, right? And to this we also say to them, right, they have to be careful also, because what is their intended goal, right? For example, there is a hadith which states that if people steal, they should chop off their hand, for example, right, to put it crudely, right? And so the punishment is to chop off the hand, okay? And people today, because they are afraid of what the public might think of them, and so they say that this hadith I reject, I don't accept. But what is the basis for them to reject this hadith? What is the basis? The chain is sound, right? And so you have, for example, you have two waters from the same river, from the same strand. They are the same basically. And I present it to you both, say this is the same, but then you reject this one, but you take the other one. What does this imply? This is selective, right? Selectivism. Basically, you select whatever you want for whatever reason, even though the chain is sound and so forth here, right? And so I'm not talking about the application. I'm not talking about the application of hadith. Should this hadith be applied? Meaning, if the punishment for someone who caught stealing, a big amount is chop off the hand. I'm not discussing the application. I'm discussing the authenticity of the hadith, right? In terms of the application, I have no right to say anything, right? Because this is up to the scholars who, if this person is caught in the Islamic land, right, and he's brought to the judge and so forth, so that is their business. I'm talking about the authenticity of the hadiths, right? So the application is a different manner. So people reject the hadiths because they are selective, right? Meaning they're following their desires. They select one thing and then they reject the other thing, right? And so when it comes to the religion, this is definitely not the way to go, right? We accept whatever that is authentic of the Prophet ﷺ. Whatever that is authentic, we accept, right? And we don't reject just because we don't like how it sounds, we don't like how it is written, right? For whatever reason, if the narrators of the hadiths are reliable, trustworthy, and the hadiths is authentic, right? There's no flaws in the hadiths and so forth here, and a lot of scholars say that it is authentic, and then we reject, that means we have a problem there, basically, right? We have a problem. And so we should not reject just because we don't like the sound of the hadith, It doesn't care. It is not relevant what the public thinks of us. It is not relevant. Right? Because you do not want to lose Allah and have the public. You rather have Allah and not have the public. But the truth of the matter is, as long as you have Allah, you have everything. Right? So you have Allah, you have everything. You have the people, you have anything, because Allah is the one who grants everything. Right? It is better to be on the side of the king than to be on the side of the people lesser than the king. Right? Because the king is in control of everything. Right? The king can make a decree and the people have to follow. Right? And so it's better to be on the side of the king. If we can apply this rationale to our everyday lives, why can't we apply this rationale to religion, to Allah, to the Quran, to our deen, so on and so forth, our taqwa towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Now obviously we have to continue learning. Right? No one can say that we have learned enough. No one can say that I'm learned, I know everything. Right? So learning always have to start, and it cannot stop. Okay? We always have to consistently learn. And so my advice towards the Hadith rejectors or the Quran only group is that think about the points that people have brought up to you, and think about the points that you have brought up to the people, and you have to honestly analyze, right? And if you are not able to respond academically without fudging, without giving it interpretation that are far-fetched and so forth, then know that you have lost. Right? Know that you have lost. You have to admit defeat. Because if you have lost and you do not want to admit defeat, right? I'm using these two terms here. Now you have lost but do not want to admit defeat, because there are people who have lost but they still think that they've won, even though the evidence is against them and they know this is against them, but because of their ego. So the ego destroys the people. So if you have lost the argument, admit defeat and mend your ways. Because why? Now it is not your ego acting, and perhaps through it Allah will grant you clarity. So all the doubts that you have regarding the hadiths, as you study them, right, it will all disappear. All your shubuhat will disappear, because it is Allah who grants you clarity. Right? But the first things first is you must, as they say, leave your ego out the window, or leave your ego at the door. Right? So admit defeat, say that you have lost, your argument is not strong. Because if you reject the hadiths, right, if you completely reject the hadiths, then basically there's no way for you to establish salah. There's no way for you to give zakah. So all the pillars of Islam, basically you are not able to do. How do you make hajj, for example? Right? And so all the pillars of Islam and even pillars of Iman, you can basically throw it out the window. And there will be multiple verses in the Quran that you cannot apply. So that means the Quran is only about 70% useful for you. Right? And so this is the wrong understanding. And so admit defeat, mend your ways, perhaps study more, and also you have to be honest with yourself. So that is the only way to go. It's not about who's winning, who is losing. If you're really serious about your akhirah, if you're really serious about where you go after you die, right, then there's no point in having this ego that prevents you just because you have a lot of followings, and then if you change your way, all these followings will drop. They will no longer support you. That is the wrong mindset, negative mindset. Because if you are really serious, if you mend your ways, the people who follow you, right, they might actually mend their ways also. And isn't that a good thing? Right? Imagine all the rewards that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the rewards that these people, they change their ways and so forth here. They make tawbah, they come back to the truth. Because of you, imagine how much reward you receive from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu a'lam, only Allah knows. If you are sincere, Allah definitely will reward you. Right? And imagine all the people that follow you and they mend their ways because of you also. Imagine all the rewards. Wallahi, we all need even the slightest bit of reward that we can get to balance our scale, to add to our skills in the hereafter. And so we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we have reward, right? We do not want to have any skills that are in our bad deeds, right? So we do not want to have more weight on our bad deeds in terms of the scaling, right, in the hereafter. So I don't think that there's any strong argument that you can bring on the table to counter the arguments that have been brought by our scholars and so forth here. And so you have to admit defeat and mend your ways. It's not about you are losing, it's not about you are winning, right? It's not about anything of that, right? And so our mindset should be more positive, we should be more rational, right? And the people that we lost to, for example, if you have a debate, you lost and so forth here, I am confident that the brothers that you are debating with, if you mend your ways and so forth here, right, nobody's going to make fun of you. It is not about worrying whether people will make fun of you or not. Right? So all these are secondary. The most important thing is you do what's right. When the evidence is clear in front of you, right, you accept. And in most cases, unfortunately, people don't accept because they lost themselves to their ego. They allow their ego to overpower them. So they allow their emotions instead of using their brain, which is the God-given faculty, the intellect, which is the most important thing that we have. And we are not using it, we are not utilizing it to its maximum potential. Then we are basically, bringing destruction to ourselves. So we should be smarter. We should be smarter than ourselves, so to speak. Right? But actually, we should be smarter than the people that are trying to bring us down, including ourselves, our ego. Right? And so, like they say, you are your own worst enemy. We are our own worst enemy. It is not a challenge against any other people. It is actually a challenge against ourselves, right? Against our desires. The text here says, revert back to the Quran, revert back to the Sunnah, right? Revert back to the Prophet. How are we going to revert back to the Prophet if we don't have the Sunnah of the Prophet? And so, again, that's it for me. I'll see you guys in my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.